There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn, the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another episode of Zooming In, a series where I engage with bookish social media luminaries to talk about literary bookish issues, bouncing off those kinds of articles online. And I would like to welcome back for his maybe 71st appearance on my channel and probably 17th appearance on this series, the wonderful Bernie Lombardi of Instagram fame. Hello, Bernie.
Hey, Shawn. Thanks for having me again.
We are here to talk about an article
That's about talking about books, so it seems rather apropos. It's from the Reactor magazine. It used to have a different name, but that doesn't matter. There is a great columnist there. Her name is Molly Templeton, and she writes really quite thought-provoking articles about the reading lifestyle. And this one is called, Why Are We Talking About Books Like This? What the language we use says about our perception of reading. And it was published in Reactor Mag on reactormag.com on February 1st.
Editing Shawn here. I realize as I've been editing the chat that I really was remiss in not giving a general summary of what Molly Templeton is actually saying in the article. So let me plant it here now. She is critiquing recent discussions in mainstream media about reading habits. She is opposed to framing big readers as elitist one-percenters, and she doesn't like it when books are reduced to mere status symbols or decor. She doesn't like the commercial lens, the superficial lens through which reading is increasingly portrayed. She is not a big fan of polls on reading habits and phrases like bookshelf wealth. She is calling for a shift towards more meaningful and less commodified ways of talking about reading, and we do get into that later in the chat.
So, Bernie, what did you make of this article?
I felt like it was really whiny.
Oh, I could see why you'd say that. Can you say more about that?
I don't know. Whiny, maybe whiny is the wrong word. I thought that the questions raised in the article are really interesting, and I think those questions are fun questions to talk about. But I questioned whether she kind of lives in a vacuum a little bit and like was not aware of the things that exist and the conversations that are being had. Because I feel like she seems very dissatisfied with like, very particular conversations around books, but then and she talks about it in a way that made me wonder if she's not aware of like all of the great conversations being had about books in places like YouTube or Bookstagram or whatever. And so it's almost like she is critiquing the elitism of the publication she's talking about, but is kind of like being elitist herself by really only regarding those publications. And I think that if she incorporated other things into the conversation, her argument could have been much more substantive.
And that's why we're here.
It's easy to write a kind of, and I guess that she is expressing an opinion. I like you, I was more interested in the kind of things she thinks we should be talking about, and the question she posed at the end. That's where I thought the real gold was. But so what does she quote? She quotes the Washington Post. And there's an article there that's commenting or reporting on a recent poll about reading, that if you read any books, you're like 46% of Americans didn't read one book last year. And then if you read more than one book, you're in the upper echelon. And if you read more than 50 books, you're in the top 1%. And the journalist at the Washington, whatever he is, opinion writer, whatever he is, at the Washington Post was kind of using that analogy of the 1% economically.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't like that way of talking about it. So she really made maybe more of a big deal than needed to be made. You're making me rethink things here. But what else does she quote?
She talks about the British GQ. I kind of just skimmed it. Did you?
Hot guy books. Well, it said brainy thirst trap. I did more than skim it, Bernie. I was looking for your picture. And the New York Times. So really, she's basing this commentary on the mainstream media. She's not basing it on what's going on Bookstagram or YouTube or book blogs or anything like that. So have you ever had any of the thoughts that she's had when you peruse the way books are talked about in the mainstream media. Maybe we can kind of narrow our focus a little bit to see, do you agree with her critique of how the mainstream media talks about books?
I understand how she feels about the Wall Street Journal article and talking about books in a consumerist way and kind of conflating being wealthy with having books, or having books with being wealthy. I think that's kind of problematic. But when she starts talking about like the aesthetics of books and how they show up kind of like in, like in the GQ article, it talks about like famous people posing with books and stuff. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I think that if people see Dua Lipa, because I think Dua Lipa is mentioned in there, Dua Lipa reading a book, they are going to say, maybe I'll read that book. Dua Lipa's reading that book. So I don't have a problem with that. I also do think that while I agree that books are obviously meant to be read, I do think that, one can have interesting conversations about books as objects and...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think, I'm interested in cover art, and I like, I have pretty nice shelves here. But you are absolutely right that you and I had a really good discussion somewhat recently about the article called it scholarship on Bookstagram, which kind of took issue with the term scholarship, but that there's a lot of really deep thinking about books and writing about books on Bookstagram, and I think there's someone talking like that on YouTube and lots and lots of book blogs. So did you relate? She said, it makes me feel very old man yells at cloud. And I never watched The Simpsons. So, of course, I clicked on the link to the meme. And it's old man yelling at a cloud. And, like, going on about nothing. So maybe you think she kind of was.
Yeah, no, I like laughed because that was the second or third time that she made a comment like that. And I was like, but that's what you're like, this is you are old man yelling at cloud. Instagram is particularly interesting because Instagram is a platform that is heavily focused on the image, right? And so the fact that Bookstagram is such a big thing kind of brings these questions together. That's kind of how I felt. It felt like maybe she's not aware of things like that, or maybe she is and just it didn't serve her purpose, in her rant. But I do think that like exploring Instagram and exploring Bookstagram and acknowledging the fact that there is such an extraordinary community of readers on Bookstagram that kind of work between, the image and the aesthetic value of a book and then like the deep conversations that she's saying she wants people to focus on. But I think that there's something to say on how those two things can work together, and the aesthetic doesn't have to be bad. The aesthetic of the physical book, like I think there's more to be said.
Do you have anything more to say about elitism in the bookish social media community? Before I want to go in a different direction, but I wanted to ask you that.
I think whenever you talk about literature, especially literature with a capital L, like it's always related to these questions of elitism and, wealth and things like that. So I think that, who goes to college and who read, like there are valid points to be made about that.
She doesn't really talk about, having money, like the class-based stuff about being able to afford. Doesn't talk about it in that way. But that is a perennial issue on bookish social media.
In this, I agree with her. To be called like a 1%er is like, because you read and have books is, not, not true. Laughably so. So I do agree with her. Like, I don't want to be associated with that. And I understand her disgruntlement about being associated with that.
He did say that journalist was possibly writing
kind of with tongue in cheek, and I had a quick look at that as I know you did, and I kind of thought, yeah, he wasn't really trying to make an elitist argument, but
yeah.
So I'd like to shift a bit. What are the ways people talk about books that you don't like, or that bug you? I think we've kind of exhausted our response to what she doesn't like, but do you have anything that you don't like?
The first thing that comes to mind, and it's not even, this is like trying to find something. It's not like I really care about this, but sometimes I think it could be overdone is like when people depend on like genre categories a little bit too much. Like when people like talk about like a Booker book as lit fic as opposed to a women's prize book as, you know, contemporary or women's literature. And, you know, I think sometimes those things, again, not that I care, but I notice when those things are done a lot and I like stop, I pause.
Well, this is going to be very interesting.
Because I'm on the other side of that controversy. I can't stand it when people say there's no difference between literary fiction and lowly genre fiction and commercial fiction. But I also realize I'm being a pompous ass, and my definition of literary fiction is if I like it, it's literary fiction. That people are trying to deconstruct literary fiction and just talking about, I'm not going to use the word literary fiction anymore. I'm just going to call it fiction. No, there's quite a difference. Even if it's hard to describe the difference, it doesn't mean that there isn't a difference. But I am very much a literary snob, so...
I think the thing for me is that there's always those books on a prize list that are people are like, oh, what is this doing on the prize list? But I do think that it's assumed that literary fiction is harder to write. And so that's why it's gets prizes. Do you know what I mean? Or that, you know, there's a sophistication to the writing that is more deserving of recognition, say, than something that is more approachable. But I feel like writing a really good story with a really, really well-crafted plot, excellent dialogue is just as hard. And sometimes I think writing sentences that are clear and, you know, just smooth and move nicely from one to the next to form a paragraph can be really difficult. This kind of stems from like back in my academic days when just trying to write and write in a way that's approachable for me, even to make what's like going on in my head then reflect on the page in a way that's readable is really challenging. So to me, that's kind of why I think about that, I guess, is because I do think that writing clearly is difficult.
Oh, absolutely. And people like what they like.
So to me, it doesn't, the elitism part, I kind of like to play around with it and be kind of pose that way. Really, it's just a matter of my own personal taste. People like what they like. And so I try not to judge other people's preferences. But when they start trying to deconstruct my corner of the literary sphere and say literary fiction, there's no such thing, I get my back up. So in fact, I don't really pay attention to the Women's Prize because I've been disappointed by everything just about that I've read. Certainly the winners usually are the worst books I've read that year. Whereas the winner of the Booker is usually one of the better books I've read that year.
I like the Women's Prize, and I'm not bashing the Women's Prize at all, but I think it's interesting that the Women's Literary Prize is the one that is associated with like being accessible, as if, you know, like women's literature, you know, should be accessible. And what accessible means, I don't know. It's just interesting. It's just interesting.
I enjoy
expressing firmer convictions than I actually have. It's part of my shtick, Bernie.
Yeah, of course.
This is a great conversation to have because one of the things that bugs me on BookTube, but doesn't bug me about you and what you do. In fact, I can't even just the preoccupation with prizes. Right now, I'm just going through a phase where I've stopped following all of the prizes. I'm interested in see who won, but so much of BookTube is so preoccupied with that there's a lot of videos I don't watch because not another one about reacting to the prize. No.
Those are like the only videos I watch.
so again, it's just what you know, and there have been phases of my BookTube presence or consumption where that has been very important to me. So, for example, I've kind of been dismissive of the Women's Prize, but one of my favorite videos each year is Eric Carl Anderson's prediction video and stuff with what talking about
Anna.
Anna.
Yeah,
she's a children's novelist. She's wonderful, and She often puts Eric in his place. It's one of my favorite. In fact, yeah, one of the very first videos I think I ever watched on BookTube was that one. Long before I had my channels. There's so many other books out there.
Mhm.
So I tend to
Sorry,
put
continue.
off reading the books that get a lot of hype during the year.
So like I have moments, sometimes even like full years, where I'm with you. Not necessarily about the prizes, but just like contemporary books, like new releases and the hyped books and whatnot, where I'm like just not into it, and I'm very much into backlist. I'm like, I'm gonna read, all the old books I never read, right? Or and that's my thing. And so I definitely have moments, but when it comes down to it, and especially with the prizes, and maybe this comes with like the like the researcher part of me, but I like thinking about how these prize lists speak to this moment. Like what are the books that are winning prizes saying about our year that like a researcher or somebody will think about in 20 years? What was 2021 all about? And you can go and look and see what books won the awards. And so like even if it was a bad year, like for example, like, oh, what's that book that I no, I'm not even going to say it, but there's a book that I like thought was like so incredibly overrated, but it won a big award. Not the Booker. It won a big award. And so like I'm like in 20 years from now, people are going to look back and be like, "Oh, like what is the fact that this book won say about the politics and the social cultural things going on, in the English speaking world in 2021?" And I've thought about it, and I have my, thoughts and opinions on it, but it's interesting. So I find that kind of stuff interesting.
I think Bob the Booker does some of that when he rereads the long lists or short lists from the Booker from 1972 or whatever, and does videos about that. And those are really interesting. And taking a longer historical view, I think it would be fascinating to look at what are some of the oldest, like the Booker's not that old, but what maybe the Pulitzer is maybe one of the older ones, goes back to what,
Mhm.
1920s or something, to look at what was on those short lists or long lists or whatever compared to what books we're reading today from those years.
Mhm.
What has become a classic versus what was popular, and
Absolutely.
that's all very interesting. Absolutely.
Mhm.
I'm a closet follower of all this stuff, but I love to grumble about it, maybe a little bit more often than you do. There was one year where a graphic novel was on the Booker. Was it the Booker or the Women's Prize?
The Booker was Sabrina.
The, yeah, and that just made me so angry, and because I'm a genre policer, unlike you, and you keep working away at me and chip away at my prejudices, but I kept saying to people that thought it was such a great idea, and I'd saying, graphic novels, don't they have prizes for themselves? Say yes. Do they have literary fictional texts on their prize lists? What the hell? Why should
There
we
was a
just open the gates? No, no, no.
there was a thriller and a long poem on that list too. Yeah.
It's not my favorite year for the Booker.
What do you think of the Carol Shields Prize? Because the Carol Shields Prize includes everything. It includes graphic novels, and it includes everything.
I think it's like all the others. I was really disappointed in what they chose as the winning book last year, but I'm always interested in what's on the lists, and beyond that, I don't follow it too terribly much. How about you?
My husband Chris follows it a little bit more than I do. I like keep track. I don't not like reading all the books or whatever. I do feel like based on last year's list, my impression is that they and even this year's list, to be honest, is that they include a lot of noted authors on the long list, or even like like highly regarded books and stuff. But then when it comes to the short list, it's more about like highlighting voices who aren't as known, because I think there originally supposed to be like a whole like mentorship aspect to it, like where like the winner or the shortlistees get like a mentorship or some, or like I don't know, something. And so like with this list, like Eleanor Catton doesn't need a mentorship, like so I don't think she's gonna win, or I don't think she's gonna win. I think she's kind of like on the list to like bring it fame and bring it people's attention to it, but I don't necessarily imagine she's gonna win. Or like last year, like the author who won the Giller was on the on the short list, but I think it was to bring attention to the list, whereas like I kind of thought the other four were way lesser known, and I was like, okay, one of them is probably going to win.
We both commented on the interesting question she posed at the end. I'm going to read a couple of them here. How do you want to talk about books? What kind of bookish conversations send you racing to the bookstore or your local library? Do you think about characters and how they interact, or stories and how they unfold, or mysteries you can't wait to solve? What can we as a bookish community do differently? How would you answer some of those questions, Bernie? Not to put you on the spot, but it is, after all, why I invited you here.
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to what I said at the beginning, is that I feel like the bookish community is having those conversations and that they're just not being captured in the Wall Street Journal or GQ, British GQ. So yes, maybe like I hope that she finds places where those conversations are being had, and maybe she would be more satisfied.
Yeah, those questions capture my imagination, but I think those ways of talking about books is very much happening on Bernie Lombardi, and I hope to a certain extent on Shawn the Book Maniac, and on lots of booktube channels and bookstagram accounts and book blogs. But I find them really interesting to think, is there anything that I wish we would talk about more or in a different way? One thing, just kind of pulling it out of the air, that I love is when I'm reading a bunch of different books at once, which is always the case, when the books start talking to each other. And I don't know how to make a video about that, or other than to use those examples, but I remember once I made a video because over a 48-hour period, 3 of the books that I was reading had scenes of characters seeing snow, adult characters seeing snow for the first time. And I was just so struck by that I made a video. But I didn't have anything particularly profound to say about it. But I love when those kinds of coincidences or whatever, synchronicities emerge. And for people that do a lot of reading, I'd like to have more conversation about that, about books that jump off the shelf at you. How do you choose the next book? And do you feel that, like, there's some kind of is the book actually jumping off the shelf? I mean, it's not literally jumping off the shelf, but is there something that's kind of interestingly woo-woo about that? Those are the kind of conversations I'd love to have. So
yeah, I love that. I love thinking. I was actually, for Independent Bookstore Day, I was doing some stuff, like on Instagram, promoting some of my favorite bookstores. And in doing that, I was trying to think about like what I love about each bookstore that I spoke about. And that's kind of the big question is, what do they have that speaks to me, right? Like, it's really, when it comes down to it, that's kind of how I assess a bookstore, is by like, what do they have on the staff recommends section? Like, what do they have facing outward? What books are in their fiction section? What publishers do they have? A big thing, like nowadays, a lot of bookstores have small independent presses, like all their books like on a shelf, and they're like, oh, like check out this shelf. And so like little touches like that, I think, are really interesting, and what I think about when I'm trying to like assess if I like a bookstore or not. And yeah, so I agree with you that those things are really fun to talk about.
The last question, I think, in the article is, how can we change this bookish landscape for the better?
I think it's an important question, and I agree with the writer of this article that these are important questions, and it's fun to think about how we can bring them to a larger audience, right? Because the Wall Street Journal, etc., are talking about books in a certain way. So like, what other big platforms that a lot of people, go to, how can those conversations be brought to them? One of the things that I like about the Booker and kind of the British bookish culture is kind of how it's merged with popular culture in a way. Like you have, like last year, like Dua Lipa, was involved in the Booker. I think she spoke at like the ceremony. And that's kind of more normalized in the UK and not as much in the US. But more recently, you have Sarah Jessica Parker has a press now. You have Reese Witherspoon has a book club, things like that. And like, we can, like, as this goes into like the whole like elitism thing, as like people who like literary fiction kind of like can, chuckle at that. I think it's good. I think the coming together of those things, those parts of contemporary culture and society, are good.
And I was quite surprised that Fallon.
Jimmy Fallon has a book club happening.
Oh,
and
really?
The books on the list were all very literary, I thought. Literary sounding. So, yeah. Bringing the high and low together. Bernie, thanks for a great chat. It was a meandering chat, but what a fascinating wandering chat. Thanks so much.
Of course, thanks for having me.